we're not going to do that.
No, I don't. We're talking
Yeah,
about.
we're going to finish this up and then talk about France.
I'm gonna be so. I'll be like.
Okay, guys,
Embarrassment.
listen up. Welcome. So, I originally meant to spend 1 day on the Dutch, and instead we're going to spend 2.5 days.
Yeah.
I do love the Dutch. I need to read, I would love to get a good book on like the Dutch Golden Age and learn more about it. But so today we're going to be talking about the decline of the Dutch and then some of the impacts of Dutch culture. And looking at some excellent Dutch paintings. Okay, so as I've already kind of mentioned, Dutch success is short-lived and attracts jealous competition from powerful rivals. So the Dutch Golden Age is not going to last very long. You've got basically 100 years where the Netherlands is a serious international power. From 1600 to 1700, the Dutch could go toe-to-toe with basically anybody in Europe. From 1700 on, the Dutch are going to be a declining power and are going to play a relatively minor role in European affairs. So the Dutch are kind of like the Swedish. Both are small, innovative nations that make a huge impact for a brief period, and then their major breakthroughs are incorporated by the larger European states. Yes?
I was wondering, like, pretty much like every European country has that like one controversial leader. Like, is there any like Dutch controversial leaders? Because we don't really hear about them a lot.
Well, so the Dutch, you mean a controversial leader? Is that what you meant? Or is that what you said?
Like a Dutch controversial leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
so
exactly.
because the Dutch are kind of a boring merchant oligarchy, during the Golden Age, they don't really ever have like that one dominant, charismatic figure. The most controversial group within the Netherlands is the House of Orange, and it seems like every single person in the House of Orange is named William. So yeah, there are like 20 William of Oranges. One is an amazing military commander during the 80 Years' War who develops some really cool breakthroughs. And then later on, there are people named William of Orange who are basically trying to overthrow the merchant republic and turn the Netherlands into a kingdom. And then there's another guy named William of Orange who actually becomes the King of England after the Glorious Revolution. So that's the closest I think the Dutch have to like a major controversial leader during this time period. Yeah, Lynn?
Where did like the House of Orange title come from? Is it just the last name? That...
You know, I don't really know the origin of it, but I do know that their house color, the orange. Yeah, but the house color of the House of Orange is orange.
Okay.
Wait, for real?
For real. Like, thank God. If the house color of the House of Orange was like white and blue, I would. They obviously wouldn't deserve to be in charge.
Orange is like a very prominent color in like Dutch sports, I guess. Like,
Yeah.
like their nickname is the orange.
Uh-huh.
That's what it translates into orange.
Yeah, and I think that's why.
Yeah.
Although during the Dutch Golden Age, a lot of Dutch patriots hated the House of Orange because they wanted to keep the Netherlands as a republic. But it's interesting that nowadays, orange is kind of like a national color. Anand?
What's an oligarchy?
What is an oligarchy?
Yes.
Oh, an oligarchy is a system of government in which a small elite group makes the laws. And so the people who called the shots during the Dutch Golden Age were wealthy merchants, mostly in Amsterdam, but then also in the other major cities.
So they didn't have monarchy at the time?
They were not a monarchy during the Dutch Golden Age. They become a monarchy later. Sneha?
Oh, yeah, so, like, you said the Dutch, like, weren't super, like, they weren't focused on, like, religion that much. But neither were the French, right?
Yeah, so the Dutch and the French basically allow religion to take a back seat, and they focus more on economic and political policy.
So then why was the French the one that became, like, why was France the one that became successful and not like the Dutch?
Well, so one of the reasons that the Dutch can't keep up with their neighbors is the Dutch are just way smaller in terms of population and territory. So even though the Dutch are performing super efficiently because of all of their new innovations, they only have a population of like 2 million people. And it's really hard for a nation of 2 million people to dominate the planet. France has like 20 million people at the same time. England has like 8 or 9 million people at the same time. So when the larger nations copy the Dutch, they're able to do the same thing but on a much larger scale.
Oh, okay.
All right, cool. So let's talk first about the English. Guys. So the English look at the Dutch and they say, hey, we could do that. We have a parliament. We have a lot of active trade. We have a large merchant class. And all of the merchants represented in the House of Commons say, let's do it. Let's have a bank. Let's have a stock market. Let's legalize insurance companies. Let's start up joint stock corporations and have them go colonize Virginia. And they do it. And guess how the Dutch respond to the English copying them? The Dutch say, nah, dude, this is our trade route. This is our ocean. And so you get a series of Anglo-Dutch wars. They're just called the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And they become increasingly uneven. The first war is really even between the British and the Dutch. The Dutch have a lot more experience. They have better sailors and better, better, just all around knowledge of naval warfare. There's one really famous attack that the Dutch launched at the beginning of the First Anglo-Dutch War, where they literally sail up the Thames River to London, cut a bunch of ships out of port near London, board the ships, and then sail away with them. So they just steal like a serious chunk of the entire British Navy at the beginning of the war. And that's that sort of like bold leadership that comes with experience that allows the Dutch to go up against the English, even though the English have a much larger population. But as time goes on and as the English acquire more experience, they are eventually able to push back against the Dutch and win a number of serious naval victories against the Dutch that allows the English to kind of ascend past the Dutch in terms of major commercial power. One of the key examples of this is the transfer of New Amsterdam to the British, which is then renamed New York as a result of this conflict. And so basically, as the English ascend as a major trading power over the course of the 16 and 1700s, the Dutch are going to start to descend. But every single major innovation that the English implement is basically just copied from the Dutch. The British East India Company is just copied from the Dutch East India Company. The Bank of England is just copying the Bank of Amsterdam. And so England just copies it and does it on a bigger scale and does it better, and then goes toe-to-toe with the Dutch and eventually puts them in their place. They also pass a number of regulations, making it harder for the Dutch to trade with English colonies. You guys might remember this from the early bits of AP US history, where the English colonists did not like that they had to trade exclusively with Britain, and they wanted to trade with other people. The other people that they wanted to trade with were mostly the Dutch. But obviously the British are not going to allow their colonists to give the Dutch money and supplies, because they're rivals. And so that is one of the big reasons that's ultimately going to lead to tension between Britain and her colonies in North America.
Wait, what was that act called again? It was like
The Navigation Acts.
Yeah, that.
Yeah, and the Navigation Acts were actually put in place specifically to hurt the Dutch. And the French, but mostly the Dutch. It's all connected.
It's all relative.
It's all relative. Okay, now the French adopt a different policy. The French are much less interested at this point in naval dominance because France has a lot of awesome territory in Europe. And so instead of focusing on copying the Dutch, they focus on just freezing the Dutch out. And they implement a number of important policies that together are known as mercantilism. And the idea here is to make France economically self-sufficient so they do not need to depend on the British or the Dutch for imports. So they put a whole bunch of big tariffs on Dutch imports. That way, if the Dutch do import anything, they can at least tax it. And then they also focus on creating French industries of their own. So rather than importing silk from the Dutch, they actually learn how to produce their own silk. And the French city of Lyon actually becomes a major silk-producing center in Europe. Likewise with other rare luxury goods. So France, instead of trying to compete with Britain and the Netherlands for importing luxuries, instead focuses on learning how to make luxury goods for themselves. We'll talk more about this when we get to Louis XIV. But mercantilism and French fashion are actually very closely linked. One of the ways that Louis XIV would seek to boost demand for new luxury products is he would simply start consuming them himself, and everybody else would copy him. So he started wearing a whole bunch of velvet, and everybody was like, oh man, now I gotta go out and buy a bunch of velvet so I can look like the king. And then he switches it next year and switches to like silk and brocade. And everybody's like, oh God, dang it. Gonna have to tax my peasants even more. Right, cool. So that's the two ways that the Dutch end up kind of getting taken down a peg. They go from a first-rate world power to kind of playing second fiddle to France and England. Questions before we move on? Cool. So, the Dutch commercial revolution has wide-ranging implications for the Netherlands, obviously, but also for Europe in general. Many of the innovations made possible by the Dutch innovations lead to sustained economic growth in Europe. So first of all of this increased investment in efficiency leads to a higher GDP per capita, a gross domestic product per capita. There is simply more stuff being produced per person than there was before. A lot of what this has to do with is the fact that the Dutch, by moving stuff around the world, allows for increased specialization. Each country can specialize in what they're best at. So instead of Sweden focusing on trying to grow food in their crappy, cold soils, Sweden can focus on mining and exporting iron and then import grain from Poland, for example. Russia can export its vast amounts of natural resources and then import awesome finished products from England and the Netherlands. And so the Dutch, by simply focusing on distributing goods where they are most needed, increases overall economic efficiency. Yes?
Were there any like countries that the commercial revolution had a negative effect on?
Indonesia.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Most of the rest of the world outside of Europe. Also, I would argue that Italy is probably negatively affected by this because, remember, Italy's prosperity was largely focused on trade. And with the Dutch now really expanding trade in the North Sea and the Atlantic, the Mediterranean is going to become an even less important trade route than before. So another thing that happens as a result of the commercial revolution, not just in the Netherlands, but also in England and other parts of Western Europe, is the bourgeoisie, the merchant class, is going to become increasingly wealthy as they reap the benefits of increasingly, continual investment. And they're going to become more politically aware and self-confident. They're going to see these burgeoning cities. They're going to see the bustling stock markets and the packed ports and the luxury goods coming in from all over the world. And they're going to say to themselves, we are the future. We are the ones who are creating this new world, and we're the ones who are paying the taxes. And there's going to be a real sense of bourgeois identity that forms as a result of this. And in many countries, especially in the Netherlands and in England, merchants are going to stop wanting to be nobles. They're going to say, yeah, the nobles are the past. The nobles are, what used to make Europe work. But now we self-educated, hardworking, dudes are the future of Europe. This is going to be really important for the French Revolution, because the leaders of the French Revolution are going to be, by and large, commoners, common bourgeoisie people who reject the legitimacy of the old aristocratic system of government. With the growth of the economy, you're also going to see the growth of government power, because as the economy grows, especially as trade grows, tax revenues grow. And as tax revenues grow, it makes it easier for governments to do more stuff. It's pretty straightforward. And last of all, I'd say it's around this time period, maybe around 1700, where Europe really starts to have a major impact on other Eurasian states. So obviously European presence has already been felt in the Americas, where they committed genocide. And obviously it's already being felt in West Africa. Yeah, and obviously it's already being felt in West Africa with the rise of the slave trade. But by 1700, European technology and European ability to deploy resources around the world is going to allow Europeans to start to have a major impact on Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and Indonesian cultures. And by the mid-1700s, the British East India Company, a joint stock company, is going to be the government in India. And there's one last thing that's not in the slideshow that is important. And that is what happens when you apply Dutch capitalism to agriculture. And what you get, anybody want to guess?
Slavery.
The agricultural revolution. And, well, so in the Netherlands, no.
Oh, yeah.
But in places where there is not a large supply of available workers, you just allow the laws of supply and demand to redistribute resources from one place to another. So you buy human labor in one area and you import it to another area. Capitalism. Yes, so capitalism, when supplied to agriculture in the colonies, definitely leads to slavery. And in fact, it's during the commercial revolution that slavery goes from kind of a, moderately significant thing that's going on in Africa and the New World to becoming the defining institution. The vast majority of slaves taken from Africa are taken in the late 1700s and basically during the 1700s. Is once you've got joint stock companies set up, you've got now the capital and the markets in place to make massive transfers of human bodies possible. But so back in the home country, slavery is not necessary. In fact, there is a surplus of labor in Europe at this point because of the growing population. So there'd be basically zero market for agricultural slave labor in Europe. If you need people to work on your farm, you just throw a rock and there's somebody who needs a job. And you can pay them basically nothing and they will do what you need. What happens is you get increasingly efficient use of scarce farmland. So we've already seen the Dutch are trying to make more land with their the windmills and the pumps and the dikes and all of that stuff. But also, you can't create infinite land. So the only thing you can do is use it more and more and more efficiently. So the people who are investing in land and agriculture are also investing in new techniques and new crops in order to boost yields. One reason for this is that the growing population of cities is leading to an increased demand for fresh produce. And so people who are farming around near cities can make a huge amount of money if they can figure out how to produce fresh veggies effectively. And they do this in a number of ways. And there's a couple of key technologies that there's a small chance they'll show up on your AP exam. So these technologies are, here, I'll turn on But so these technologies include crop rotations, new crops, new tools, and privatization. In England, also known as enclosure. So, a lot of these are actually based on applying new scientific principles to the farm to increase yields. So crop rotations are important because if you grow the same crop on the same spot every year, you will attract pests to that spot that eat the plant that you're trying to grow, and you will exhaust the soil. So you need to rotate crops around. There's also an amazing fact that people are becoming aware of at this point, which is that some crops actually make the soil better. These include beans and also alfalfa and clover, which you can use to feed to animals. So if you rotate a food crop within a cover crop that restores the soil, you can farm year after year in the same spot without exhausting. You also see the development of new tools during the agricultural revolution. Better plows, also a particularly useful device called a seed drill, which makes it more efficient by planting each seed in its own little individual hole. It makes it much more efficient. And you also get the breakdown of the traditional communal village and the selling off of common lands. Now, this is straightforward capitalist theory. And the idea is that private lands will be used more efficiently than collectively owned lands. The tragedy of the commons is that everybody uses up a common resource as fast as possible and doesn't take care of it. Whereas if a single person is responsible for the land, they will invest in it and take care of it. And so, more in England than in the Netherlands, but in both cases, there's a push to make communal land private, to sell it off to successful farmers, and to allow those successful farmers to use that land in whatever way they think is most profitable. The idea being that that will boost the productivity of land that was otherwise being mistreated and underinvested in. So that's the agricultural revolution, and I think you can argue that the agricultural revolution is largely the result of the commercial revolution. There's bigger cities and more money around to invest in agriculture, which results in increasing agricultural productivity, which is then going to lead to even larger populations, which is then going to lead to even more overcrowding in the cities, and is going to help to explain the rise of the Industrial Revolution in turn. Yes?
What years was the agricultural revolution happening?
Roughly the same years as the commercial revolution. It doesn't happen all at once, but basically as the Dutch and the British become more and more capitalist, their agriculture becomes more and more efficient. To the point where Dutch agriculture by the year 1800 is 7 times more efficient than Russian agriculture. Yeah.
How much did the new tools increase production?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the data that I have for you is seed yields. You remember that's the rate of how many seeds you get per seed planted. So this is like for wheat or barley or other basic grain crops. So in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, in England and France and the Netherlands, the average seed yield was 1 seed to 5. So for every 1 seed you plant, you harvest 5. And so that doesn't count for the seeds that don't germinate or the seeds that get killed by pests or that rot or whatever. You get 5 back. By the end of the agricultural revolution, the Netherlands and southern England are producing at 1 to 12 or 1 to 13. So it more than doubles the efficiency. But it also requires greater investment of capital and knowledge as well. Okay, cool. Any other questions about the commercial revolution? Sweet. All right. I think I'm going to stop this video and then start a new video.